The billionaire CEO thought he left his past behind, until he saw a little girl with his eyes holding another man's hand. 4 years ago, Grayson Grant stood at the height of his career, having just secured one of the biggest deals of his life. His name was splashed across business magazines, and his face regularly appeared on financial networks. He was the kind of man who didn't stop moving, didn't look back, and didn't allow emotion to interfere with logic. His life was a calendar of boardroom meetings, investor calls, and cross-country flights. And then there was Rachel. She had walked into his life like a breath of fresh air, unexpected, genuine, and completely unlike anyone he had ever been with. She wasn't interested in his wealth or his influence. She was quiet but strong, full of passion for her art, her dreams, and her independence. For a time, they existed in a strange balance, his world of order and hers of creative chaos. They met in a coffee shop, where she had spilled her sketchbook on the floor and he had helped her gather it, not knowing that this 5-minute moment would become the start of something neither of them had planned. Over the course of a year, they grew close in a way that scared him. Rachel brought out a softness in him, asked questions that no one dared, and expected truth when he was used to giving half answers. And when she told him she loved him, something in him twisted. Not because he didn't feel it too, but because he did, and that was dangerous. Grayson had been raised to believe that emotion was weakness, that vulnerability was a flaw. So when his career demanded that he relocate to London for an extended project, he made a decision that would haunt him. He ended it with Rachel in a 3-line text message. No call. No explanation. Just a final goodbye disguised as practicality. He told himself it was cleaner that way, that she would move on, that it was for the best. Rachel sat on the floor of her small apartment for hours after that text, staring at it, unable to understand how something that had felt so real could disappear so easily. But then she felt the early symptoms, the nausea, the fatigue, and within a week, she knew. She was pregnant. She considered telling him. More than once, her finger hovered over his contact in her phone. But every time, she remembered how quickly he had walked away. She didn't want her child to grow up with someone who saw them as an obligation. So she made the choice to raise her baby alone. No drama. No court battles. Just quiet determination. That decision marked the end of her old life and the beginning of something far more difficult. She took freelance art gigs, worked nights teaching painting classes, and lived on coffee and sheer willpower. And when her daughter was born, a tiny girl with Grayson's blue eyes and blonde curls, Rachel named her Luna, after the moon that had kept her company on sleepless nights. In those early years, as she rocked Luna to sleep with lullabies and whispered promises, Rachel built a new kind of strength. One that didn't come from having everything under control, but from showing up every single day, no matter how tired, no matter how alone. Grayson faded into the past. Or at least, she thought he had. Because fate has a way of pulling unfinished stories back into the light, often when we least expect them. Rachel's days settled into a rhythm, the kind born from necessity rather than comfort. Mornings began before the sun, with Luna crawling into her bed and whispering for cereal and cartoons. Rachel would rub the sleep from her eyes, tie her hair into a loose bun, and carry Luna to the kitchen, where a single mug of coffee served as her armor for the day ahead. She didn't complain. She didn't have time to. Between painting commissions, part-time work at a local art supply store, and weekend lessons at the community center, Rachel's life was a delicate juggling act held together by love, exhaustion, and silent grit. Luna grew into a curious and joyful child, the kind who asked questions about everything and laughed with her whole body. She had inherited Grayson's ocean blue eyes and bright smile, but everything else was pure Rachel, the way she danced through puddles, her fascination with stars, the way she instinctively reached for her mother's hand even when she wasn't afraid. People often commented on how much Luna resembled Rachel's husband, and Rachel always just smiled and changed the subject. The truth was too complicated to explain in passing. She had stopped expecting anyone to understand. When Luna turned 2, Rachel met Mark Dillard. He came into her life like most people do when you're too tired to question motives, quietly, helpfully, conveniently. He was a friend of a friend, a man with a good job, steady routine, and a polite smile. At first, Rachel found comfort in his stability. Mark didn't ask too many questions about the past. He brought groceries when she was sick, fixed the leaky faucet in her bathroom, and offered to watch Luna during her weekend shifts. And for a while, she let herself believe that maybe this was what healing looked like, not fireworks, not passion, but peace. But peace, she learned, can be deceiving. Over time, Mark's helpfulness became control. He started questioning where she was, why she was late, who she was talking to. He criticized her parenting, made comments about Luna being too soft, too spoiled. He didn't hit. He didn't scream, at first. But his words were sharp, his tone icy, and his presence grew heavier with each passing month. Luna didn't like being alone with him, though she never said it directly. She clung to Rachel more, grew quieter, more withdrawn whenever Mark was around. Rachel noticed, but she pushed the thought aside, telling herself she was just imagining things. Still, something in her stayed alert. Some deep maternal instinct kept her from fully surrendering her trust. She told herself she was being smart, just careful. But the truth was, she didn't feel safe anymore. And that scared her more than she wanted to admit. Mark had never asked about Luna's father. He assumed, perhaps, that he had left, or had died, or had never mattered. Rachel never corrected him. There were some stories better left untold. But even as she tried to move forward, the ghost of Grayson lingered like a shadow behind her every choice. She wondered sometimes what he would say if he saw Luna now. If he'd regret leaving. If he'd even recognize the shape of her face or the sound of her laugh. Rachel didn't allow herself to think those thoughts often, because they didn't change anything. Grayson had made his choice, and she had made hers. What mattered now was keeping Luna happy, protected, and unaware of the heartbreak that had brought her into the world. Rachel painted at night when the apartment was silent, her fingers stained with color, her mind full of what-ifs she would never say out loud. And then one ordinary Thursday afternoon, everything shifted. It began with a chance encounter in a crowded place and a single look that cracked open a past she thought was buried. What Rachel didn't know yet was that the story she thought had ended was only just beginning. It was supposed to be a normal day, another predictable stretch of hours filled with errands and noise, ending with Luna's favorite bedtime story and Rachel passing out with a brush still in her hand. They were at the airport that afternoon not to travel, but to pick up Rachel's friend who was returning from a short trip. Luna had insisted on wearing her favorite dress, the yellow one with tiny stars, and had braided her hair herself, which meant Rachel had spent 10 minutes trying to fix it without breaking her daughter's heart. Mark had come along, uninvited but insistent, his presence making the air around them feel a little too still, too sharp. He held Rachel's elbow just a little too tightly as they walked through the terminal, and his tone, while calm, had that edge she'd grown used to ignoring in public. They stood near a coffee kiosk when it happened. Rachel was kneeling to fix Luna's shoelace when Mark stepped aside to take a call. That's when she felt it, that peculiar awareness, the sense of being watched. She stood slowly and turned, and that's when she saw him. Grayson. He was standing across the terminal, holding a cup of coffee, frozen in place. His blonde hair was shorter now, and he was wearing a sharp gray coat over a suit, looking every bit the powerful executive the world saw him as. But his face had gone pale. His eyes were locked not on her, but on Luna. Rachel couldn't move. Her heart beat so hard it drowned out the noise of the terminal, the overhead announcements, even the low murmur of conversations around them. Luna, oblivious to the tension, looked up and saw him too. She blinked at Grayson with her bright blue eyes, the same eyes he saw in the mirror every day, and tilted her head with innocent curiosity. She had no idea who he was, but something about his face made her stare a little longer. Grayson took a cautious step forward, as if approaching a dream he didn't want to wake from. "Rachel," he said, his voice hoarse. She hadn't heard that voice in 4 years, and it hit her like a wave. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Luna reached for her hand, sensing the sudden change in her mother's body. Grayson's eyes dropped to the child. His expression shifted, softened, and then crumbled into something like disbelief. "Is she?" he began, but Rachel cut him off. "We're waiting for someone," she said quickly, her voice too sharp, too forced. "It's not a good time." She picked Luna up and started to turn away just as Mark returned. He gave Grayson a quick, suspicious glance and then looked at Rachel. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm but with a thread of threat laced underneath. Rachel didn't answer. She just nodded and walked away, not looking back. Grayson didn't follow. He stood rooted in place, the paper cup in his hand growing cold. He couldn't stop staring at the little girl now walking away in Rachel's arms. He didn't need a paternity test. He knew. Every cell in his body screamed it. That was his daughter. And Rachel hadn't told him. His breath caught in his throat, and a strange, unfamiliar ache filled his chest. For a man who thought he had everything under control, in that moment, Grayson realized he had never been more lost. Grayson didn't sleep that night. He sat in his high-rise apartment overlooking the city skyline, his untouched dinner cold on the counter, his phone in his hand but no idea who to call. All he could see was the little girl's face. Her eyes. His eyes. He kept replaying the moment in the airport over and over, Rachel's stunned expression, the way she had shielded the child so instinctively, and the man who had appeared beside her, his posture, his possessiveness, his presence. Grayson's chest burned with questions he had no right to ask and guilt he hadn't known was still buried that deep. By morning, he had made a decision. He cleared his calendar for the next 3 days, much to the confusion of his assistant, and drove across the city to the only place he could think of, Rachel's last known gallery. He hadn't been there in years, but the owner still remembered her. "She doesn't show work here anymore," the woman said with a note of sympathy, "but she used to rent studio space across town. You might try asking there." With that fragile thread of a lead, Grayson drove aimlessly, his mind split between memories and what-if scenarios. He couldn't understand how she had kept it from him. Had she truly believed he wouldn't care? Or had he given her every reason to think he'd walk away again? By late afternoon, he found himself standing in front of a small brick building with a sign that read Artworks Collective. The place smelled like paint and old wood, the hallway lined with abstract pieces and student work. A young assistant pointed him to the second floor. "Studio 3. She's in today, I think." Grayson climbed the stairs slowly, each step louder in his head than the one before. When he reached the door, he knocked once, softly, then again. No answer. But the door creaked open slightly, and he saw her inside. Rachel was sitting at a work table, her hair tied back, brush in hand, completely absorbed in a canvas. The sight of her, so focused, so familiar, momentarily disarmed him. He hesitated, not wanting to interrupt, but she looked up, and their eyes met again. This time, she didn't flinch. She simply set the brush down and stood. "I shouldn't have come unannounced," he said, voice quiet, apologetic. "But I didn't know how else to reach you." She crossed her arms, not angry, but guarded. "I'm surprised you even tried." He stepped inside slowly. "I need to know the truth, Rachel. Is she mine?" Rachel didn't speak for several seconds. She looked down, exhaled, and then nodded once. "Yes. Her name is Luna. She's 4. Grayson felt the words hit him like a punch to the chest. 4. That meant she had already been pregnant when he left. He sank onto the nearest bench, his hands trembling slightly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her answer came quickly, but without malice. "Because you left without saying goodbye. Because you made it clear there was no room for me in your world. And I couldn't let my daughter grow up wondering if she was unwanted." He closed his eyes. The shame curled in his stomach like ice. I didn't know. I didn't even give you the chance to tell me. Rachel, I made the worst mistake of my life. There was a long silence between them. Then Rachel stepped forward. She's not a mistake. She's everything. I didn't need your money or your name. I needed peace. And I had to protect that. Grayson looked at her, really looked at her, at the tired lines beneath her eyes, at the strength in her posture, at the quiet fury that came from having survived alone. Can I meet her? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Not to interfere. Just to know her. Rachel hesitated, torn between instinct and possibility. Then she nodded, but her voice was firm. One condition. If you're going to be in her life, it's all or nothing. No disappearing. No broken promises. Grayson met her gaze and, for once, didn't look away. I'm not going anywhere this time. And for the first time since the airport, something in Rachel's face softened. Just a little. Enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, the door wasn't fully closed. Grayson spent the next few days preparing himself in ways he never had before. It wasn't about presentations or business deals now. It was about being seen, not as a CEO, not as a man who had once walked away from love, but as a father meeting his daughter for the first time. That idea both terrified and humbled him. He had built companies, negotiated with governments, spoken at global conferences, but nothing had ever made him feel so unsure of his footing as the thought of facing a 4-year-old girl who didn't even know who he was. And yet, despite the fear, he wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything. Rachel kept her word and agreed to meet at a quiet park just outside the city. She chose a place where Luna felt safe, a small grassy space with a wooden playground and a bench shaded by a willow tree. When Grayson arrived, she and Luna were already there. Luna was playing in the sandbox, her back to them, a little sun hat shielding her face, a plastic shovel in one hand and a determined expression on her lips. Rachel stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, a quiet watchfulness in her stance. She gave Grayson a single look that told him this was her world, her rules, and if he so much as faltered, she would shut the door again. He nodded in understanding and approached slowly, his movements careful, not wanting to disrupt the peace. Rachel called Luna's name gently, and the little girl turned, brushing hair from her face. Her eyes locked on Grayson's, and he saw the flicker of recognition again, though she didn't understand why. She tilted her head in that same curious way she had at the airport. Luna, Rachel said, crouching beside her, this is my old friend Grayson. He wanted to meet you. Luna looked at him for a long moment, then blinked and said, hi. Her voice was clear, light, and entirely unafraid. Grayson knelt beside her, suddenly aware of how unimportant his tailored coat or expensive watch was. Hi, Luna, he said softly. That's a beautiful castle you're building. She beamed, the way children do when someone pays attention to their world, and without hesitation, she handed him a second shovel. You can help. Rachel watched from the bench, something caught in her throat as she saw the two of them settle into the rhythm of shared play. Grayson didn't press, didn't try to force connection. He asked about her favorite color, listened as she explained how the princess turtle lived inside the sandcastle, and laughed when she buried his hand under a pile of pebbles. For over an hour, he stayed on her level, patient, curious, open. And Rachel, despite herself, began to hope. Eventually, Luna grew tired and curled up in Rachel's lap with a juice box. Grayson sat nearby, his voice quieter now, his expression serious. She's extraordinary, he said. You've done an incredible job, Rachel. She nodded but didn't respond, unsure of what to say. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they hadn't said in years. Finally, Grayson spoke again. I know I don't deserve a place in her life. I know I can't erase the past. But I want to try. I want to be here, not just for today, but for everything that comes after. Rachel looked down at Luna, who was now dozing in her arms, her face soft and trusting. "It's not about what I want anymore," she said. "It's about what she needs. If you're going to do this, you do it fully. You don't disappear when it gets complicated. You don't come and go. She's not something you get to sample. She's a whole world." Grayson nodded. "I understand. And I'm ready." He meant it. She could see it in his face. Not the polished mask of a CEO, but the raw, sincere vulnerability of a man who had finally stopped running. She didn't smile. Not yet. But the wall she had built around herself for years finally shifted, if only by an inch. Because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the story she thought had already been written. Maybe, it was the beginning of one they hadn't dared imagine. Grayson began showing up in small, quiet ways, never demanding space but always being present. He asked Rachel for permission before each visit and never questioned her decisions. He arrived early for weekend park outings, brought Luna picture books from his childhood, and learned the names of all her stuffed animals without once glancing at his phone. Luna, cautious at first, began to warm to him with an openness that surprised even Rachel. There was something about the way Grayson listened, how he never dismissed her questions, how he let her talk endlessly about rainbows and dinosaurs and princesses without trying to rush her. He made room for her, not as a distraction from his world but as the center of it. For the first time in years, Rachel felt something shifting, not just in Grayson, but in herself. She watched them together from the kitchen window while they played in the backyard with sidewalk chalk, Luna giggling as she drew crooked suns and stick figures while Grayson knelt beside her, truly engaged. Rachel didn't want to admit it, but the sight of them like that unraveled parts of her she had long buried. She remembered the man she once fell for, the one who had memorized her coffee order and held her hand during her first gallery show, and she wondered if that man had ever truly left or if he had simply been hiding under the weight of ambition and fear. But not everything was simple. Mark hadn't gone quietly. After Rachel asked him to move out, he began calling late at night, showing up unannounced, questioning her judgment and throwing accusations with a venom that made her stomach knot. Rachel did her best to keep Luna sheltered from it, but the tension hung in the air like static. Grayson noticed the change in her posture, the way her eyes darted toward the door whenever a car passed the house. One evening, after a particularly tense phone call that left Rachel visibly shaken, Grayson stayed behind after Luna went to bed. He didn't push her to talk. He simply sat across from her at the kitchen table, his hands folded, his expression calm but serious. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself." Rachel looked at him for a long moment, something trembling behind her eyes. "I've been doing it alone for so long, I don't know how to let someone help." "You don't have to figure it out tonight," he said gently. "But I'm not going anywhere. And you need to know that." She nodded slowly, the words sinking in deeper than she expected. For the first time since Luna was born, Rachel allowed herself to lean into the quiet strength of another person, even if just for a moment. That night, after Grayson left, she stood in Luna's doorway and watched her sleep. The little girl was curled up with her favorite blanket, her thumb resting near her lips, her expression peaceful. And Rachel realized she wanted that same peace, not just for her daughter, but for herself. Over the next few weeks, Rachel and Grayson settled into an unspoken rhythm. They weren't a couple, but there was an intimacy in their co-parenting that made others assume otherwise. Luna began to refer to him as, "my daddy," without prompting, and when she did, Rachel's breath always caught in her throat. There were moments, small, unassuming ones, when she'd glance at Grayson reading on the couch while Luna climbed over his shoulder, and the idea of a second chance no longer felt impossible. Still, Rachel remained guarded. She needed more than consistency. She needed proof that Grayson understood what it meant to stay, not just physically, but emotionally. She needed to see that he wouldn't run again, no matter how complicated things became. Grayson, to his credit, never asked for more than she was ready to give. He didn't rush. He didn't expect. He just stayed. And little by little, the walls between them began to crumble. Not from grand gestures or declarations of love, but from the daily, ordinary ways Grayson showed he was in this for real. Not just for Luna. But for Rachel, too. It had been almost 3 months since the moment in the park, and in that time, Grayson had become a steady fixture in both Rachel's and Luna's lives. He was there for Saturday morning pancakes, for bedtime stories when Rachel needed to work late, for Luna's first ballet recital where he sat in the front row with his phone held up like a proud father. He helped paint Luna's bedroom in soft lavender and hung up glow-in-the-dark stars just because she asked. More importantly, he never once stepped over boundaries Rachel hadn't offered to move herself. There was a quiet understanding between them now, one built from shared responsibilities, cautious smiles, and a history they no longer avoided but learned to respect. Rachel began to see Grayson differently, not just as a father, but as the man he might have been all along, had he not been afraid. He asked questions about her art, about the years he had missed, about what she needed now. He wasn't trying to fix the past anymore. He was trying to honor it by showing up differently in the present. And Rachel, though still hesitant to label anything, could no longer deny that the air between them had changed. There were looks that lingered a bit longer than they should. There were nights when they'd clean up after dinner in a kind of silent harmony, her hand brushing his arm and neither of them pulling away. One evening, after Luna had fallen asleep watching her favorite movie, Rachel found Grayson standing on the balcony of her apartment, looking out over the city. She brought him a cup of tea and leaned on the railing beside him. The night was quiet, the sky a deep velvet blue, and for a while, neither of them said anything. Then, without turning to face her, Grayson spoke softly. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't walked away." Rachel's throat tightened, not because it hurt to think about, but because she had thought it 100 times herself. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was calm. "Then Luna wouldn't be Luna. And maybe we wouldn't be here now. I hated you for a long time, Grayson. But I don't anymore. You came back. And you're here." He turned toward her, his expression raw. "I still regret it every day. But I'm trying to be the kind of man she can be proud of. The kind of man you don't have to protect her from." Rachel met his gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. A kind of forgiveness, not declared, but understood. She reached for his hand, just briefly, and he held it as if it were the most fragile thing he'd ever touched. It wasn't a grand declaration, or a sweeping gesture. It was quiet and steady and full of meaning. Later that night, after Grayson had gone, Rachel stood at Luna's door again, watching her daughter sleep with her small hand wrapped around a stuffed bear. And for the first time in years, she let herself imagine a future that wasn't just about survival, but about building something whole. She could see it now. Not just Grayson in Luna's life, but in hers too. Not as a shadow from the past, but as someone who could be part of something new. A partner. A father. Maybe even more. She wasn't ready to say the words yet, but the feeling had rooted itself deep, and it was growing. Not because she needed saving. But because, for the first time, someone had truly shown her what staying looked like. The morning of Luna's 5th birthday was soft and golden, the kind of morning that felt like a gift. Rachel woke up to the sound of tiny feet padding across the hallway and Luna's voice whispering excitedly to herself as she peeked out the window. Rachel smiled to herself before slipping out of bed and making her way to the kitchen where the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls had already started to fill the space. Grayson had arrived early, letting himself in with the spare key Rachel had finally given him the week before, a gesture that had spoken louder than any conversation ever could. He was standing at the stove in jeans and a gray t-shirt, barefoot, humming under his breath as he flipped pancakes and poured warm syrup into a small pitcher. When he saw Rachel enter, his face lit up with that quiet, content expression she had come to look for without realizing it. They moved through the morning like a family that had been doing this for years. Luna tore through wrapping paper with delight, laughing when she saw the art set Grayson had chosen just for her, complete with glitter markers and tiny canvases. Rachel had baked her favorite chocolate cake the night before and decorated it with rainbow sprinkles, and when they sang Happy Birthday, Luna stood in between them, holding both of their hands, her smile so wide it made Rachel's throat tighten. Grayson caught her eyes across the candles and gave her a look that said he felt it too, that in this simple moment, something had healed. Later that afternoon, after the guests had gone and the apartment had quieted again, Rachel sat on the balcony while Luna napped in her room. Grayson joined her with 2 mugs of tea, and they watched the sun sink below the buildings in a wash of warm light. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore, it was full, familiar, almost peaceful. Rachel turned toward him, something unspoken sitting just behind her eyes. "I don't think I ever believed I'd get to have this," she said quietly. "Not just the parenting part, but this peace. This feeling that someone is here and isn't going to leave." Grayson reached over and took her hand, not as a question but as a statement. "I spent years building a life that looked perfect from the outside, but it was hollow. I didn't know what I was missing until I saw Luna. Until I saw you again. Everything that matters to me is right here." Rachel felt something open in her chest that she hadn't let herself touch in a long time. A hope that was no longer fragile but rooted, grounded in something real. She looked at Grayson, not as the man who had broken her heart, but as the one who had worked to mend it, slowly, carefully, piece by piece. "You were wrong about something," she said, a faint smile on her lips. "What's that?" he asked, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You said Luna made you want to be better. But I think you already were. You just didn't know how to let people see it." Grayson didn't respond with words. He leaned in and kissed her, gently, with the kind of certainty that only comes when there's nothing left to prove. It wasn't rushed or hesitant. It was full of everything they'd fought to rebuild. When they pulled apart, Rachel rested her forehead against his and closed her eyes, letting herself feel the weight of the moment. Inside, Luna stirred in her bed, murmuring in her sleep, her dreams quiet and safe. And out on the balcony, with the sun setting and the city beginning to hum, Rachel and Grayson sat together in a peace they had earned, not through perfection, but through forgiveness, patience, and the kind of love that never really leaves, it just waits until both people are ready to find their way back. In my opinion, the ending of this story is not just a resolution, it's a quiet triumph. What began as a painful, unfinished love story evolved into something far more meaningful: growth, redemption, and the choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Grayson's journey wasn't just about reclaiming what he lost, but about earning it through vulnerability and consistency. Rachel, who carried the weight of heartbreak and motherhood with fierce independence, didn't need rescuing, she needed partnership. And Luna, the heart of it all, found herself surrounded by love that was once fractured but finally whole. The beauty of this ending lies in its realism, messy, slow, deeply human, and that's what makes it powerful. It's not a perfect fairy tale, but it's the kind of love story that actually lasts.